before we do this, I'd love to just introduce Brent to the audience. So I'm super happy that Brent Never is here. Brent is an associate professor in public affairs at the Henry Block School at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And he also runs a Center for Data Education, Analytics, and Science that is particularly interested in data science for pressing public problems. And he and I have had many conversations about how cities need to use data to help the public. And so I'm really looking forward to your talk, and I really appreciate your making time late on a Friday for you. Thank you, Brent.
Thanks, Anthony. And let me go ahead and just share my screen here. So you all have been through these before, and this is my first time through your particular group. But as Anthony said, if you have a pressing question that needs to be answered right now for clarity's sake, for your understanding, absolutely go ahead and ask. And also, if you had a question that's more substantive, where you wanted to dig into a subject, we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussions. And then I think Amir is the leader of the chat also. So I'll try and keep my eye on the chat, but sometimes you know how it goes. You get a little carried away, and so he can always flag me down if there's something pressing. So thanks again for having me. As Anthony said, I'm Brent Never. I am at the Henry W. Block School of Management here at UMKC. So it's kind of interesting. Anthony and I have had lots of discussions. I am actually a political scientist by training. So you all will maybe be a bit out of your zone when I'm presenting, but I really would value you saying, okay, well, I could see how this comes back to my world, whether it's engineering management, or something of that sort. Because I am in a school of management, though, and I do teach quite a few management courses, this is not, completely, this won't be, completely foreign to what you all do. So I want to talk today about what's called the Bloomington School, and leave it to economists to name their particular university a school. So we have the Chicago School, for example, which is the Chicago School of Economics at the University of Chicago. It's kind of the Milton Friedman sort of model of economics. If you all are in econ or took a micro econ course, that's kind of that brand. There's actually a at Virginia Tech, Blacksburg, a school of economics, which is more bringing in kind of institutions and the like. And so the Bloomington School is from Indiana University, and it has a very different flavor than a lot of these schools. And hopefully for those of you who are in an urban sort of environment or a regional environment where you have a lot of moving parts, this school might speak to you. The whole idea is that we live in complex adaptive systems, and cities just absolutely typify this, right? So your mayor or your city council can put forward a singular policy that then has 18 different side effects that, apparently nobody thought about, or maybe somebody did think about. So this way of thinking is really important in the Bloomington School. So let me do some definitional issues just so that we're kind of speaking the same language. And then we can certainly go deep into actual examples, which I think are more exciting. So let's first off sort of describe what a social dilemma is. So you all are in an engineering school, whether it's in engineering management or engineering. And so this might be somewhat foreign to you. This picture here is of John Nash, and you may know John Nash. You may have heard of something called the Nash equilibrium. But most people who aren't in econ know John Nash because of the movie A Beautiful Mind, which was out about 15, 20 years ago. which was about the life of John Nash, who was an economist at Princeton. And he received the Nobel Prize, and the Nobel Prize was really about his description of what a social dilemma was. Just to back it up a fraction, economists, amazingly, leave it to economists, I hope I'm not offending anybody on this Zoom, but economists sort of up until John Nash really kind of assumed away any sort of conflict, right? They just assumed that, everybody's pursuing their individual well-being, and therefore, if everybody's individual well-being is aggregated up, it's everybody's collective well-being. And that really is the Chicago School of Economics. And John Nash, famously kind of backed it off and said, no, there's a lot of times where you work in your own individual self-interest, but it leads to everybody else being worse off. So that's the classic definition of what a social dilemma is. And here are three sort of, types of social dilemmas that we usually talk about. The first one is the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is straight out of Law and Order, right? So the show Law and Order, where they get two suspects to a crime, and they throw them into two separate interrogation rooms, and they try and work each of them against each other, right? So it's that classic setup where the one person is, they're trying to get each other to rat each other out. And so the prisoner's dilemma is, if you rat out your friend, we'll give you a lower sentence, and we'll give him the worst sentence in the world. And of course, your friend has that same offer. So each of them has this incentive to just rat out the other one, so to pursue their own self-interest. But basically, you rat out each other, and everybody's worse off because everybody gets the maximum sentence, right? So that's the classic prisoner's dilemma. And if you kind of bring it out to more sort of typical situations, I use this example here. Supporting environmental causes. A lot of us support environmental causes. I do also. And so you kind of champion this idea of a collective good, and we're all better off if we all, do things that are environmentally friendly. But then, you have a big family and you buy a big car. And so you're saying your individual self-interest is ultimately more important than that collective interest. And if everybody makes that same decision, we're all going to be collectively worse off. So that's the idea of the prisoner's dilemma. There's a lot of math behind it, but that's the basic logic. The next idea of a social dilemma is something that's happening right now in my community, and I'm sure with yours. For those of you who are NPR listeners or PBS watchers, you know the fund drives, right? So it comes on and you're like, oh God, another week of them kind of yammering on about how we need to give. And, NPR, PBS, it's a classic public good, right? So you can tune in, you can get your NPR fix without paying a dime. There's no way for them to put a gate around NPR and charge entrance. And therefore, there's an incentive to free ride, to wait for the next person to be the sucker to pay for your NPR or to pay for your PBS. And similar to the prisoner's dilemma, if we all have that incentive, nobody's going to pay for NPR, and therefore we're not going to have NPR. So that's another class of social dilemma. And the third is the tragedy of the commons. And I'm going to spend more time on this. You all are in a very beautiful part of the country in the Pacific Northwest. You understand issues of logging. You understand issues of fisheries. These are classic commons. A fishery is one. You talk about the salmon fishery out there. If I catch that salmon, you can't catch that salmon. And I have the incentive to catch the salmon before you do because it's worth money. And so if everybody has the incentive to catch the salmon first, we're going to overexploit that salmon because everybody's trying to catch the salmon. You get a bigger net, you get a bigger boat, and pretty soon the tragedy is this ever worsening cycle of more and more consumption. And we have that with forests. So with the rainforest in the Amazon, we have it with aquifers. Out here, I'm in the middle of the country. We have a huge aquifer underneath 8 states, and everybody has an incentive to pull out water before your neighbor does, and therefore we have that tragedy also. So these are all bad, right? These are all things that economics really didn't have an answer for. What the heck do you do when you have these sorts of problems? So we have to talk about, well, there are different types of goods out there, different ways of thinking about solutions to these social dilemmas. So this is a typical way that economists think about this. And I started out to say I was trained as a political scientist, but it's kind of tricky because I was also trained as an economist. I don't like saying that because then people don't like you. So I was trained as a political scientist and an economist. And my PhD advisor was an economist, and I'll talk about her in just a little bit. But really, she sort of built out this 2x2 matrix in her career. And so on the dimensions, we have whether a good is rivalrous or not. So rivalrous means that if I eat that apple, you can't eat that apple, right? So something that's purely rivalrous is only one person can consume that thing. Versus something that's non-rivalrous, like the air, I can breathe it, you can breathe it, we're all able to breathe it. So that's non-rivalrous. Excludable is the ability to, cut off access to that good. So my car has a key that opens the door and starts the ignition. So I can exclude you from using my car. And a non-excludable good would be something like a city bus, right? Here in Kansas City, we just made all of our buses zero fare. So anybody can jump on the bus. There's no gate, you just walk on the bus and you can use it. So that's non-excludable. So if we think about where we put goods on this, we have private goods that are excludable and rivalrous. And these are the things that the market handles really well. This is where the Chicago school people just go crazy. It's the best thing. I would say 98% of all transactions really happen in this private goods sort of realm. Food, iPads, nobody uses an iPod anymore, iPads, cars, shoes, that's all stuff that's excludable. And if it's excludable, therefore you can have a market because people, if you can exclude access, then you can have scarcity, and scarcity is what drives a market, right? So that's pretty cool over there. The exact opposite is public goods. Those are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So these are things that oftentimes government pays for or provides, I should say. So national defense is non-excludable. Antony doesn't pay her taxes. It's not like the US military says, we'll protect everybody except for Antony. The US military is out there protecting everybody. And also it's not rivalrous. One more human being in the United States doesn't make the US military less able to do its job. And so that tends to be where government has to be involved, because something that's not excludable, therefore you really can't have a price attached to it because it's not scarce. So a market can't really price it, and you can't really sell it. These others kind of off diagonal are, I think, where the cool things really are. So let's talk about club goods or toll goods. Again, they're excludable, but they're non-rivalrous. So if you can imagine a toll good would be like a toll bridge, You know, there's a gate when you get on the bridge. If you pay, you can go on. If you can't pay, you can't go on. So it's excludable, but it's non-rivalrous. You can attach a price to it, but it doesn't necessarily get congested. A bridge could get congested, but here I'm by the Kansas Turnpike. Kansas Turnpike is 400 miles long from Kansas City almost to Denver. It doesn't get congested, right? You can get a ton of people on the Kansas Turnpike. Club goods, it's the same name. You know, a country club, you know, could be a club good. And then lastly, our common goods or common pool resources. So these are the things that we really studied at Indiana. And I talked about that. So an aquifer, for example, a fishery stock, it's non-excludable in the sense of an aquifer under 8 states. If you can stick a wellhead down into the aquifer, you can get that water. And so can your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor. So it's not excludable, but it is rivalrous. If I pull that water out and water my soybeans or my wheat, you can't use that water. So, you know, that's great, but let's talk about the problems attached to each of these types of goods. So, you know, the problems attached to private goods are that they, you know, there's an incentive to lie. There's an incentive to hide information about your good. I just sold a car this week, and you know, when you sell a car, it's a funny kind of thing. I try to be a very honest, good human being, but you know, it's if they don't ask the question, you might not provide the answer. So, you know, is it a good car? Oh yes, it's a great car. You know, yeah, it was great. Hey, did you change the oil every 3,000 miles? Oh yeah, absolutely change the oil every 3,000 miles. Great, I'll buy it. They didn't ask about the fact that my wife was in a fender bender, and you know, we had to put on a new bumper. I don't feel bad about it because I don't think it affected the quality of the car at all, but they didn't ask and therefore I didn't provide. That can get really bad though, information asymmetries, because there can be an incentive to outright lie. There's a whole class of goods called post-experience goods where you don't know you've been harmed until way after the transaction. You don't know you got food poisoning until 6 hours after you ate the meal. So it's kind of a class of problems in private goods. In public goods, free riding. Talked about the NPR problem. And then in club goods or toll goods, the real problem is over exclusion. So, you know, you think about a hot summer, the only pool in town is at the country club. The country club can exclude your access to the pool. Also, though, more importantly, think about private schooling. Say, you know, for example, my kid has a fairly severe learning difficulty, and there is a school in town that is private, and you can pay for it and you get excellent, you know, education for kids with learning difficulties. But if you can't pay, you definitely can't go, even if your kid really needs that service. So that is a classic problem of over exclusion. And I talked about common pool resources where you have that incentive to overuse. So everything except for the pure private goods really needs to involve some other solution, like government being involved to protect the interests of other people. So that's where political scientists come in. So if you think about solutions to these social dilemmas, typically we've thought about 2 different solutions. So one solution is a market solution. So just privatize it, you know, and let the market deal with that. So I'll use kind of an example that's kind of troubling, which is organ donation. So in this country, we have a system of organ donation where good-hearted, charitable, altruistic people give an organ. We don't have a market for that. In fact, we have a very, you know, Byzantine type of system about how we allocate organs. In Iran, for example, they have a privatized market for organs. So if you need a kidney and you have the resources, you can pay a donor his or her price for a kidney. So that is the idea of, well, this is how a market could work and solve a problem. The other way of solving a problem is the state to come in. So the government to come in and say, we're going to solve the problem. So a good example of that is, you know, I'm trying to think of a good example. So a fishery that is an inland fishery. So it's a lake, it's an inland fishery where a government can come in and say, you know, there's permits, you can only fish this much. If you overfish, you get, you know, a fine or a prison term. Like, for example, the crab fishery in Alaska oftentimes works like this because there's only so many places you can unload your crab, and therefore they have a point where the government can use the coercive powers to make sure that people don't create a social dilemma. A really interesting example, I think, is out on the Serengeti. One of my professors wrote a really interesting book about thinking about exotic animals down in southern Africa as common pool resources. So rhinos and elephants and giraffe. If you think about it, it's hard to exclude people from that because there are these vast swaths of land where these animals are. And so you always have poachers and whomever kind of finding ways into the system. But it is rivalrous, right? If a poacher kills a rhino, that's the rhino, that's it. And so you can think about neither of these two solutions work too well. A market solution, are you going to privatize that rhino, right? Is that going to be Amir's rhino and only, you know, Amir's in charge of the rhino and he can dispose of the rhino as he sees fit? That's not really workable, I would say, in that system. Or, you know, we've tried the state system, right? So Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana have very elaborate, you know, park ranger systems where they're trying to use state control over protecting those sorts of animals. And that, you know, sort of has failed also, right? And so the question is, well, what the heck are we going to do? You know, are we just going to see the rhino population die out? And here's the way the Bloomington School thinks about it. So let me give you a little background about it, and then I'll let you in on how we sort of think about it. I say we because this was where I was trained also, and so I drank the Kool-Aid. I believe in it. It started at this place called the Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana, and it was founded by Lynn and Vincent Ostrom in the 1960s, and so it's tremendously interdisciplinary. Political scientists, environmental scientists, atmospheric scientists. I mean, people who are very hard science, people who are social science, legal scholars, sociologists, the like. They're all involved in this. And really, the way that people in the Bloomington School kind of think about the world came out of a lived experience of Lynn and Vincent Ostrom. So I'll give you a hint of why this school has received a lot more interest lately is because Lynn Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. So the first woman ever to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And also, ironically, she called herself a political scientist. So also the fact that she was a woman and that she was a political scientist winning the Nobel Prize in economics rankled a lot of folks. But back it up a bit, her training and her husband's training, Vincent, really came out of water rights in the West. And there you guys are out in the Pacific Northwest. They were at UCLA in Southern California Similar kind of issue though, right? The typical way that water rights have been dealt with out west is government coming in, that coercive standard that we were talking about just before, where government came in, they took people's land, they created huge public works projects, and ultimately they created a system of winners and losers. So, you know, different people have different access to water at different prices. And really this sort of bothered, you know, Lynn and Vincent and then the scholars around them, not because they didn't believe in environmental causes. In fact, they felt that unfortunately this system created such perversions that it could lead to a lot of cheating. For example, if the government can't catch you, you're going to kill that rhino, or if the government can't catch you, you're going to waste that water. And so they really had this deep feeling that people who own their own solutions are much more likely to abide by those solutions. And that really spoke to me. That's why I went to Indiana. And really, you know, I'm in a public administration department, so I'm surrounded by other folks who think that, you know, big government solutions are wonderful, and I do too in some instances. But I feel like the people who own their solutions are probably going to get the best answers. And so the whole idea is that solutions need to be flexible to the problem. They need to grow and shrink as problems grow and shrink. And, you know, there are tremendous kind of unintended consequences when we have either only the market involved or the state involved. So there needs to be this middle zone where it's neither the market nor the state that are helping to solve problems. So if you think about this photo here, so this is a rice paddy in Nepal. And so this is actually a classic common pool resource problem. And you may not be able to visualize it, but a lot of folks understand that rice is a very water intensive product, right? So the rice paddies have to be underwater for a significant part of the growing season. And you can even see a little pipe in this photo. And basically the way rice paddies work in these mountainous regions is the water is pumped up to the top paddy, and they get first access to the water. And then it drains down to the second paddy and down to the third paddy and down to the fourth. And if you think about kind of the power dynamics involved there, if it were a market situation, the person at the top paddy has every incentive to hoard the water or try to sell it to the person in the next paddy down. And the solution, so the market would work that way, right? Well, price would solve it. So people at the bottom would have to pay the most to get the water all the way down to them. But you could have a state solution. So the country of Nepal, the state of Nepal could have police officers looking over every paddy, but of course that would be expensive and open to corruption. The solution is a rotational solution. So the way these paddies work are every season you move down one paddy as a family. So you are at the top paddy this year, but if you screw the next family down, well, next year you're going to be down one paddy, and pretty soon the family at the bottom moves back up to the top. So you can see year over year, you have this incentive to not only look out for your own individual self-interest, but you also have that incentive to look out for the collective interest. And that has been a system that's been in existence for millennia. And so Elinor Ostrom wrote this book. It's actually a 30th anniversary just last month, called Governing the Commons, which really catalogs these sort of interesting solutions where people have come up with ways of solving really difficult issues Whereas our inclination would have maybe been to have the market or the state solve those problems. So, here are some examples. For you all up in Oregon, the forestry is really important. When you think of forestry, I'll use the context of a developing country, whether it's in Central Africa. I did my work in West Africa, but in Central Africa, in the Congo and Uganda, or whether it's the rainforest in South America. Um, just like the rhinos, it's not as possible to have the government protecting something as large as the rainforest. So we have a lot of illegal cutting. And also the market isn't working because it's so large that ownership rights aren't really well defined. If you go in, you can cut down the forest before the next guy cuts down the forest. And it's this ever worsening slash and burn sort of scenario in the upper right. And so a lot of the Bloomington School people worked in these areas where they worked with local villages about creating these rule systems whereby everybody had an incentive to monitor each other, but also to selectively cut their forest and steward their forest in a way that they're all going to be better off in the long run. And the second photo is an irrigation system in Spain. This irrigation system it's amazing. It's been documented for a millennium in existence. And irrigation is the same sort of idea that if you're at the headwaters of the irrigation, you have every incentive to use all the water. But these villagers over the course of centuries have developed this very intricate system of monitoring how water moves so that the person at the headwaters never has that incentive to screw the person down the line. And lastly, the lobster fishery, I think, is the most interesting. I am from the Northeast, so I would go to Maine in the summer. In Maine, these lobsters, they have these lobster fisheries, unlike the tuna fishery or some ocean fishery. Lobsters all exist within 100 yards of where they're born. And therefore, families own little plots of the ocean floor where they can fish, and they all unload their lobsters at specific harbors because there are very few harbors in Maine because the terrain is so tough. And they all sit at the bar where everybody unloads their lobsters, and they all drink a beer and watch each other unload the lobsters. And if somebody comes in, maybe they're a new person, they have a new access to lobsters, and they overfish. The guys take them out back and they teach them a lesson. And there's a book about the lobster mafia and how this happens. That's a solution to the problem. Let's talk quickly about non-ecological ways of thinking about commons. I had a buddy, he wrote about dog parks, which is very esoteric. But if you think about a dog park, that's it can be thought of as a common pool resource. You can't really exclude somebody from a new municipal dog park. Very few communities have dog park police. And so it's not feasible to do that, but it is kind of rivalrous because we've all been to dog parks if you have dogs, and if there's dog do everywhere, it's not a pleasant place to be. And so at dog parks, there are these unique kind of ecosystems where people watch over each other, they commune with each other, they sit at the picnic table, they sanction bad actors at the dog park. I think more interestingly, we're right now writing a set of papers on philanthropy as a commons. We all have only so many dollar bills in our wallets. During COVID times, we're being asked more and more to give. And so our wallets, unfortunately, are not as excludable as you might think, right? We're constantly getting peppered on Facebook, on GoFundMe's, on whatever to pay for various causes. And therefore, we're getting donor fatigue. I study philanthropy, and you see a lot of trends that are very worrying about people are giving less often and they're giving less amounts. So how do you create a system where people will not face that overfishing for the dollars in your wallet, right? So how do you govern your commons, your wallet? And lastly, in the urban context, um, we're looking at urban real estate as a commons problem. So we've traditionally thought about it as a private transaction. It's your house or your family's house, and you can sell it. But if you think about the collective interest, neighborhoods can change based on your individual decision of whether to sell and to whom you sell. So there can be bad actors buying houses. Gentrification can happen because of these individual level decisions. So if you kind of bring it out one unit of analysis, you can think of urban real estate as a commons. And how do you develop a community level solution such that people still can buy and sell houses, but how people are not going to be tempted into selling to bad actors? And how do you create this productive cycle where you're all looking out for each other and creating a stronger neighborhood versus creating a weaker neighborhood? And this is really important to Kansas City because we do have this as a very strong problem in Kansas City. So, I do want to close on this, and we're at universities and we have this problem too, where as scholars, it's kind of anarchy at UMKC and at many universities. Everybody's going after different extramural funding, NSF, NIH. And it's a little bit like the Commons. We're all trying to go out after that tuna, that $1 million grant, and we're beating each other over the heads trying to get to it. We're in effect getting the bigger boat and the bigger net. And so how do we think about a system at a university that's going to be self-reinforcing but voluntary, so that we can all work together to get tuna, but also to have it sustainable? So how do we get those grants, but how do we make it so that we're all growing together and using those funds in a productive sort of way together? So I know I talked fast and I have other things to say, but I think this is probably a good time for you all to ask questions, maybe come up with examples and see if they fit or not.
Thank you so much, Brent. So people can please write their questions in the chat, and then Amir will moderate. But I'll just go first because it occurred to me when you talked about the housing in Kansas City that this is maybe a little bit different from the lobster fishers in that it's not that observable what's going on. You don't know what your neighbor is going to do next. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to what extent is data and knowledge part of being able to manage the commons as a community, and is there a specific role of data science in this?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Anthony. So there's a couple elements I would say. One element is you pointed out of commons that have worked for a very long time there's a monitoring mechanism that helps reinforce good behavior. And usually it's a monitoring mechanism that where costs for monitoring are shared by everybody. So like a neighborhood watch sort of system where everybody benefits from neighborhood watch and everybody takes a turn at walking the block or however you organize it. So the real problem, as you said, with urban real estate or any real estate really, is that these transactions happen in a title office or they happen, quietly. And in Kansas City, for example, right now we're tracking during COVID times, a lot of families selling houses just for cash, just to keep food on the table, right? So, you know, in urban neighborhoods, some of these houses are $8,000, $10,000. They might have been grandma's house. Grandma passed on. We have this house. It's been there for 3 or 4 years, you know, family now decides to dispose of it, right? And so I don't know about Portland, but here we have a lot of We Buy Ugly Houses franchises. Those are cash sale franchises where they'll come in, they'll buy your house for cash, they'll give you a lowball offer, but it's you know, we pay for it and it's done. And the real problem with that, not only from a sense that people's wealth is largely in their families' homes. So you're basically burning your seed corn when you sell a house at a fire sale price. But the second real problem is that those happen under the radar. So what we're doing now is we have a data scraping. We're web scraping our Jackson County website. So that's where they post all transfers of deeds. And so they of course put in the worst possible format to actually get the data. You know, wouldn't it be great and ideal if it were in a nice relational database that you could just, you know, hook into? But we have a web scraper now, and we're tracking those communities where these cash sales are happening, because we want to alert the community to be the monitors for the community, saying, did you know that 5 houses on this block have now been sold to this actor? Because that's when things happen quickly. And so we're trying to create a dashboard where neighbors can then start monitoring themselves, because we can't be there all the time. We're professors. We want to create the tool. We want to create the methodology. And then we want to empower the neighbors to monitor. And so that's what we're doing on that front.
Everyone, you can actually use the raise hand feature as well, and then I can unmute you if you want to actually ask your question.
So, and I have a question for everyone. So I'm a professor. I'll call on you. It's okay. You know, so I won't actually call on you. But for those of you who exist in the engineering space in one sort of way or another, you know, whether it's engineering in the public space, whether, you know, here in Kansas City, we have a few engineering firms that really specialize in, for example, water systems, things that are paid for largely by municipalities. For you, do you ever exist in a space where the market in your mind has kind of failed in a project, and where the government has sort of failed, and where you faced sort of this social dilemma where everybody is kind of, nobody's looking after the collective interest? Nobody's been in that experience?
Or people are very shy.
Okay, here's a good one. All right. One potential example of this is open source development. Well, explain to me open source development, because I'm not exactly familiar with it.
You want to unmute and just give a bit more context to the question?
Yeah. Gentrification is a good example. Yes.
Oh,
unmute.
Oh, sorry.
I just unmuted.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, so I posed that question. The open source development is a style of development where basically a project, typically a software project. Hundreds of people across the world are involved in developing some fairly useful and complex software. And there are, but the use of that software is typically free. So people get to use it regardless of whether they contribute or not. And there's no relationship between what the benefits are and what the input is.
Yeah.
So that's the definition of open source development. So since you asked for an engineering example, I thought that would be a good one to get your thoughts on.
That's an excellent one. Yeah. So you think about like Linux, you think about
exactly.
Yeah. Now I know exactly. I have my mind in real estate development. Now I understand what you're saying. And so there's a lot of scholars now in this area called the knowledge commons. And kind of how we deal with that. So if you think about, for example, academic publishers, right? So you think about Elsevier and you think about Sage or whomever the academic publisher is, there are these academic journals. So oftentimes what happens is scholars put in all the effort. They, maybe the NSF underwrites the research, and then these scholars write articles for free, and then they're reviewed for free by other scholars. And then Elsevier, for example, charges, an arm and a leg to access that article. And I only bring that up because there's a movement right now towards open source scholarship. And Elsevier, for example, sees this as an existential threat. And it's similar to maybe like a Microsoft seeing a Linux sort of model as an existential threat to their business model. And so what Elsevier kind of does is they put a fence around their commons. They put a fence around, or a paywall around, accessing that commons or that scholarship. And now that technology is making it cheaper to have a commons and not have a fence, it's an existential sort of question. That being said, the real question though is, well, why do people want to, for example, exist in GitHub and add to projects? Why do people want to go on Kaggle and do a competition? And that kind of flummoxes economists, right? This just kind of breaks our brain. Like, why are people spending time for free making Linux better? And what I would say is it's a little bit like a good neighborhood watch, where everybody feels a collective, we're in this together. And so there's this collective, this is making the world a better place. And that's exciting because we're seeing more and more examples like GitHub, where technology is really helping people collaborate and collaborate because they feel better about the collective good. And so I find it tremendous. All right, Daniel, you said gentrification ? And absolutely, that's something we're looking for in the Kansas City context. But Portland, for example, has gone through a tremendous real estate sort of, I don't know, upswing in the past generation. And we're trying to be on the front end of this. So, my co-author in these projects is from the University of Washington. He was a professor out there for a long time in Seattle. And he saw what happened to Seattle over the past generation and a half. And he doesn't want that to unroll that way here in Kansas City. So that's why we're creating these kind of monitoring mechanisms. such that developers can't buy up 6 houses in a row without anybody knowing, and then just bulldoze them all and put in a new development. Okay, so the next one, about Linux, etc. They've shown that social status and fun are big components of, and I think that's so exciting. I think that's a great example. The rice farmers in Nepal aren't in the scheme because they find it fun and exciting. But when you think about these open source software environments, there's this real ethos. In fact, because I run this data science center, one of the things we do is we run a series of workshops. So we run a Python workshop, an R workshop, a SQL workshop, and we pay to have instructors come in. And oftentimes our instructors are really put off by the fact that they have to sign a university agreement that all of their effort becomes the intellectual property of the University of Missouri. And it also bothers me, but it's a standard contract. And it bothers them because they're of the ethos of the GitHub ethos, right? Of like, well, I'm going to put this up on GitHub anyways. So how is the University of Missouri going to stop me from doing that? So it's this new mentality that's exciting, and gives fits to our lawyers here at the university. Okay, Anthony. Anthony, how about you go ahead and just explain your question?
Well, a lot of cities right now are trying to build repositories of city data. For example, the data they collect in their transportation systems or other infrastructure systems, with the idea that this could then benefit the greater good, maybe help some startups to get cool data science companies off the ground, do all kinds of wonderful and good things. And so my question is this open city data, is it a commons? Is it a public good? Yeah. How would we have to organize this according to the Bloomington School to make sure it's for the good of all of us?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complex because this is an area where I work, right? So I work a lot with government data that is open access. And I was actually on a commission here in Kansas City, and we try to be very data forward in Kansas City. We were the first city to get Google Fiber. We had this huge influx of kind of young tech entrepreneurs into our city. And so we had this commission to, what do we do with this open data? We have a little disclaimer, it can't be used for, private enterprise. But, a little disclaimer is not going to stop a name your data aggregator from coming in just like a tuna fisherman on a boat with a big net and just taking all the data off and adding it to their data aggregation service. And so that's in that sense, I think of it as a common pool resource, right? So we can't exclude, but in some ways you can think about it as being sort of rivalrous in the sense of if this data aggregator takes it and puts a paywall around it, and makes it in a format that's really easy to consume, then they kind of own that intellectual property. I know it's not a clear kind of example. You could also argue that it's just public good, right? So it's not rivalrous, anybody can use it. It's not, you can't keep people from using it. If you think about it though, as a CPR, it's a hard nut to crack. So the best commons systems that work are ones where people have ownership in their success. So how do you create a system where people need to be sort of verified into that system? Sort of like GitHub, right? So you kind of get a credential in GitHub, And if you're known as a good actor where you've been putting in a lot of work into other people's projects, you then get more, sort of access and preferred access to more interesting projects. How do we create a system with kind of city data where it's open to everybody, but the good actors have more preferential access to that good data? I don't know the answer, Anthony, but I wish I knew. And if you all have answers, I would love to know. All right. Speaking of data, common good, energy utility world. Okay. All sorts of data about energy consumption, solar and the like. Consider consumer data. It's not public because of privacy issues. However, the data would be incredibly useful. How do you balance privacy with common good? Such an important question. And I also think there's a corollary with health data. So here in Kansas City, we have Cerner. So Cerner is one of the two big purveyors of electronic medical records here in the country. So we have access here at UMKC to the Cerner data. It's so there's HIPAA protections on electronic medical records, but de-identified, it could be really important, especially in COVID times, to kind of figure out, where COVID's kind of happening, even without testing, where you could start to see, hey, these are kind of other issues that people are going to see a medical provider for, and maybe that's more indicative of where COVID is happening. So, one strategy is de-identification. It's, aggregating up to a unit where you couldn't understand necessarily those singular sort of data points. I could imagine, though, where with the electricity grid, you may want to know that outlier. Why is Anthony using so much energy? And what is it about Anthony on that block that makes him, her household so interesting? Location information is key. So I'm a GIS person. So I want to map it, and I would like to know Anthony's house or my house on a map, these points. And clearly when it comes to electronic medical records, we can't do that. And so I think aggregation, unfortunately, is the answer du jour for getting at that. There could probably be some interesting blockchain ways of thinking about it. Maybe ways of protecting individual identity, yet understanding the collective stream of information. But I'm not an expert in that. Right.
If I can maybe piggyback on that, are there ever commons in which we say, well, we accept that, for example, privacy is not protectable. We cannot manage the commons without the data or without the information, but we can have commons rules that would protect the individual from the negative effects of having given up privacy. So is there kind of a second layer of commons management that you're aware of that could help in this case?
So I'm not aware of it, but it's important right now with COVID-19, right? So we are protecting people's identity. I know at my university, at your university, I'm sure at other big organizations, we get emails daily about there have been 2 COVID cases in the School of Engineering building. The people have been notified, blah, blah, blah. But, that doesn't help with, say, contact tracing. It's hard to, if the person doesn't want to be identified, actually our public health agency here in Kansas City will not identify that person. And therefore, the university kind of has a very hard time with contact tracing and getting that information out. Protecting people from the downside, would be so important. If you're labeled as somebody who has COVID-19, there's stigma, there's maybe even worse, right? There could be somebody who might do you harm if they knew you had COVID, or they felt like you gave COVID to other people. So I don't know how you protect people in that sense. And so that's where a state solution is where we've landed, right? Now it's interesting to think about a market solution. What if people could sell their information about COVID, right? So this year, the two economists that won the Nobel Prize won it based on auctions. So what if people could bid on your information, right? They could say, we really, really, really want to know whether you had COVID or not. And you name your price and say, for $50, I will tell you I had COVID, and I'll show you the certificate that I had COVID. Everybody has a price in the market. And therefore, you can, so instead of protecting them from the downside, I sound so crass, instead of protecting them from the downside, you're compensating them on the upside, right? So that's probably the way an economist might think about that. So Lily, how would you encourage a comment in an individualism-oriented sort of culture? That's an excellent question. I think so. So to get back to Lynn and Vincent Ostrom, they were, it's not cool to say that in certain circles, but they were libertarians. All right. So they were very much in this mode of, individuals individuals understand themselves the most, and individuals have, there's a necessity to protect individuals' interest. But they always quoted Tocqueville. So Tocqueville was this French guy, came to US in the 1830s and wrote this book. And his quote is, self-interest well understood. So basically, America in Tocqueville's eyes worked well because we had self-interest well understood. So yes, America, the American dream, all this stuff is really built on this idea that self-interest is really important. But well understood is the other half of that. And by what he meant by well understood, and it's a 1,200-page book, so he explains it in a very long sort of way, is that Americans also have a deep commitment to community. And he went to community after community in America and saw that people cared about their neighbors. They cared about their faith institution. They cared about other institutions like journalism that helped them understand others. And that was really important. And I worry now when we talk about kind of libertarianism, because it's a different brand of libertarianism that we're talking about right now, which is like, you stay off my lawn, I stay off your lawn, and that's it. And that's, I would argue, is not the well understood part. And I sound Pollyannish, and by the way, I'm not a libertarian, but I do feel like we need to get back to, and we need to have leaders start talking about the well understood part. And it doesn't have to be a big national discussion. It can be, I know my neighbor, it's COVID, I'm able to go to the grocery store, they're not able to, I pick up their groceries every week. That's well understood, and that's kind of something we do see in COVID America, and we can feel good about that.
Thank you. So we are in overtime.
Yeah, sorry.
I think these were awesome closing words. Thank you so much, Brent, for your talk and the really good discussion. I think this is a lot of food for thought moving forward. So thank you. We really appreciate this on a Friday evening for you. Thanks.
Well, thanks, everybody. And if you ever have questions, please just shoot me an email.
Thank you. And so next week, we will have a talk about resilience, organizational resilience, specifically in the light of COVID, and how that looked for OHSU. And And so I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. For those of you who want to earn credit and have questions about the format, I'll stay on this call for a little longer in case you want to know something. And for everybody else, have a happy weekend and a fun, socially distanced Halloween. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.